In this video, we'll understand what the Rabbinic interpretation of Daniel's 70 weeks is. Reminder, hit the subscribe button below, turn on the notification bell to stay up to date as new videos come out. And if you're interested in supporting this ministry, just go to justscripture.org and click on the support page. So far in our 70-week study is that we have covered verse 24 that provided the scope of the prophecy in its length and purpose. But before diving into the final three verses, is that we shifted our exegetical study to conduct a broad survey on early interpretations of the prophecy, starting with the early Christian views. There, we saw that the only thing agreed upon was that the weeks were understood as 7 literal year periods, but where they started and finished them was all over the map, and no agreement if the 70 weeks were consecutive or did allow for a gap between the end of the 69th and start of the 70th. Needless to say is that it was a very eye-opening experience and study for a lot of us out there, because you likely have not seen all the different interpretations over those early centuries. But I got a feeling that many are really curious to see what the Jewish side brings forth in the debate. Before we go diving in on that is that we need to see this from a chronological perspective. And what I mean by that is that we need to have two periods in mind. One is called the Second Temple period, and the other is the Rabbinic period that follows the 70 AD destruction up until today. So basically, anything post 70 AD. But many will allow for the Second Temple period to reach until the end of the first century, because the New Testament was written during this time and does fall under the category of Second Temple Jewish literature because it was written by Jews. And also is that you have Josephus writing his works, and they fall better under this time period than the Rabbinic. Now, we need to add some more detail to the Second Temple period because there are various groups within it that we need to remind ourselves that were around and were quite distinct from one another in their beliefs. Because after the Maccabean revolt is where the emergence of the Pharisees, Sadducees, and the Essenes come about. The Essenes likely being the Qumran people who harbored the Dead Sea Scrolls, were around at least until the end of the first Jewish revolt. The Sadducees dissolved right after Rome destroyed the Temple and Jerusalem. The Pharisees, however, continued on past the time of the first revolt and through the other two revolts coming in the later decades. Another group that gets often overlooked, but is really important to our discussion, is the Zealot movement from 6 AD to the end of the first revolt. Now, once we get past the final two revolts, is that only the Pharisees are still around, and out of them and their beliefs comes the Rabbinic period. And that's huge because when taking up the question about early Jewish beliefs, is that what you'll hear from modern rabbis is only representing one stream of thought. But thankfully, there is one more group that has survived until today, and that is the Jesus movement. Now, I hope that little history lesson has reoriented your thinking when we start to look at what the rabbis have said. With that, it's also better for us to redefine our titles as well, reflecting the full picture of those who were around. Now, the what and who we'll be covering here in the Rabbinic period can be viewed in 3 time periods, with the modern, medieval, and the 2nd century AD that will all be rooted ultimately in the Talmud and Seder Olam. The thing to remember and note here is that the Talmud contains both the Mishnah and Gemara that is collectively understood as the oral law. How much weight this holds depends on which type of Jewish person you ask today. A Reform one will say that it's not that authoritative, and really they don't think the Old Testament is either, mind you. Conservative Jews will say that it's authoritative, but it can err from time to time. Orthodox, however, will say that it's on the same level as the written law that was given to Moses on Sinai, because they will say that he also received this oral law there, so thus it's also divine. Now, if you're thinking, does this mean that we're going to have a lot of different interpretations and schemes from the rabbis? The answer to that is thankfully no, and to avoid sounding like a broken record, is that I'm going to present more or less their interpretation in a whole sense rather than by each rabbi. So we're going to start with their chronology view, and let's see what modern rabbis have to teach there. The three main ones that you will find on the internet and YouTube are Rabbi Kravitz, Skobac, and Singer. All three head up a counter-missionary group whose primary focus is on undermining missionaries' attempt to convert Jews into believing Jesus is the Messiah. We'll also touch on an article from the site Aish, but just note that it states that it draws upon Singer's explanations. To fast-track ourselves here is that the rabbis are 100% unified and that the 70 weeks end with the Second Temple's destruction, and that verse 26, Mashiach, being cut off, is the starting point of the 70th week. Verse 27 would be seen as describing more details of what's going on in that week. Now, back in verse 25, with the first 69 weeks, is that the rabbis will say that the first anointed came at the end of the 7 weeks, and they will emphatically defend the two Mashiach view. But here's where it gets interesting, because they will say that the first Mashiach came 7 weeks after the first temple's destruction by Nebuchadnezzar. So, the first temple's destruction is their starting point, a point that we did not see in our Christian surveys in our last two videos. But I'm sure you're already thinking, okay, so 587 BC must mean that they have a gap in time between the end of the 69th and the start of the 70th. Nope. But how can that be? Well, simple. Modern conventional chronology is completely wrong, and that the real date for the first temple's destruction is 421 BC. Now, if you think I'm just blowing smoke at you on this, is that I'm not. And what we are now dealing with here is what is called Rabbinic chronology. And yes, there's a 166-year difference between the two. But how do they possibly think there's somehow 166 years less in the timeline? I mean, you have every ancient historian, chronographer putting it in the early 6th century BC, not the late 5th. And what about the archaeological evidence? King's List from the ancient Near East and all the astronomical dating of major events. Do the rabbis really think the entire scholarly world is off by 166 years? Yep. But maybe you don't believe me, so here you go. Rabbi Kravitz for JewsForJudaism.org wrote, "These are the 70 years for the first exile, 52 years under Cyrus, and 18 additional years to dedicate the Second Temple, and 420 years of the Second Temple." So you see, the 490 altogether with 70-year exile, plus, more important, him saying that the Second Temple period was only 420 years. He goes on saying, although there appears to be a discrepancy in chronology between the Jewish and secular Gregorian calendars of 166 years, with the secular dates earlier, is that it's clear that the Jewish record keeping is more reliable and consistent concerning these events. And here comes the justification. Because Babylonian calendars changed arbitrarily with every new Babylonian king, and limited archaeological discoveries often reflect their arbitrary chronology. Rabbi Skobac for Jews for Judaism Canada agreed with this chronology in his survival seminar that can be watched online. His Daniel 9 video is 2 hours long, and you have to go to the end at the 148 mark to hear him say that the Second Temple stood for 420 years. Rabbi Singer's discussion on the 70 weeks can be found on his audio series of Let's Get Biblical on the show Tanakh Talk on YouTube. And if you dig enough, you can find a fully developed chart of his, and on the bottom left-hand side of that you can see him stating that the Second Temple stood for only 420 years. And you see the same from Rabbi Rosenfeld on Aish.com saying that the Second Temple stood for 420 years. Now, with Rabbinic chronology being the basis for their 70-week system, is that following their chronological thinking can get really challenging because during their presentations, they'll bounce between Rabbinic and Gregorian dates. And a piece to that is that they'll typically refer to key events in terms of years from creation, not the normative BC AD dates. To help ourselves here is that the 3338 Rabbinic date is equivalent to 421 BC. So we'll add it on our chart because maybe an Orthodox Jew is watching this right now and thinks in those terms of creation dates instead. Either way, both sets of dates will be presented to help both groups track along. Now, I'm sure you got a lot of questions floating around in your head on all of this, but probably the most curious one is, where in their timeline did they gut out 166 years? Because that's a pretty big compression, and the corresponding Gentile empires' time frames would then have to be adjusted somewhere or in places as well. The Babylonian Empire rule is recognized as 70 years between 3319 and 3389, with the temple being destroyed in the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar from Jeremiah 52:12, which Rabbi Skobac even makes reference to Jeremiah 25's 70-year prophecy, which we'll discuss much more later on. So, under Rabbinic chronology, Babylon's 70-year period has to be brought forward, squeezing down the Persian period substantially, with the Second Temple being finished in Persia's 18th year of rule over Judea. Now, how they fill in the remaining 420 years comes from two primary rabbinic sources. The first is from the Talmud. In Avodah Zarah 9a, it says that Persia continued to rule for 34 years after the Second Temple was built. Then the Greeks ruled for 180 years, then the Hasmoneans for 103 years, then the Herods for 103 years as well. And finishes saying that from this point on comes after the Second Temple's destruction. So, the four numbers added together is 420.
Wait a minute, that doesn't look right, doesn't come out right.
It's right, Artie. Billy?
You gotta carry the one.
So, these four periods make up the Second Temple period in the Rabbinic view. So, what happens on the bottom of the chart is that Alexander's conquest is dated roughly 16 years later, or 13 years later, from 32 or 30 BC. But I think the most shocking piece to all of this is that the rabbis have made the whole Persian period lasting only 52 years. Where the Talmudist writer is likely getting this from is the Seder Olam Rabbah, the Great Order of the World. Finished around 160 AD, likely by Rabbi Halafta, is that it covers history from creation to the Bar Kokhba revolt. You can see that the last 3 chapters are relevant to our discussion. How we know that the Talmudist writer is very, very likely getting his info from Halafta is that he referred to him just before in 9a in 8b that he was his source. And you can find other examples in the Talmud where he is mentioned as the Seder author as well. At the end of chapter 28 in the Seder, it refers to Yoshi discussing the 70 weeks and that it lasted from the destruction of the first temple to the destruction of the second temple, with 70 years for the exile period and 420 for the second temple period. The Seder goes on in chapter 29 saying that Israel spent 52 years under the rule of the Babylonians after the first temple's destruction. The whole 70-year period is composed when you factor in Jeremiah 52 saying that it was in the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar, meaning that 18 total years have elapsed, plus the 52 left over makes 70. Please take note that the Seder references Jeremiah 29:10 and Daniel 9:2 as the exile period by saying, then they went up. It's an important piece to the modern rabbinic system. Then the Seder describes that after 18 Persian years, the temple was rebuilt, which makes 70 total from the destruction. Then talks about how Ezra came up 5 years later in the 7th year of Artaxerxes. Then chapter 30 opens up describing Nehemiah's time to the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, with the statement that the period of the Medes and Persians was 52 years. Just remember, we're working with Google Translate here, so if it looks kind of it's the best we're going to get right now. Then references Rabbi Halafta with the Greeks ruling 180 years and both the Hasmoneans and Herods ruling for 103 years apiece. Now, moving ahead by nearly 1,000 years is that we come to one of, if not the most, revered commentators in rabbinic history with Rashi. He, too, followed the same viewpoint that the 70 weeks started with the destruction of the first temple to the destruction of the second, and remarked the same combination of 70 and 420 years that makes the whole set of weeks. Following soon after him is Abraham ibn Ezra. Sorry about that. His verse 24 commentary spoke about how the 70 weeks were 490 years, concluding with the second temple's destruction. Also composing around this time was Maimonides, aka Rambam. He also goes with the rabbinic timeline of 410 years for the first temple, with 70 years of exile plus 420 years for the second temple, thus 490. About 100 years later, Nachmanides, aka Ramban, debated Dominican friar Pablo Cristiani, a convert from Judaism to Christianity. An interesting thing is that Pablo argued for Jesus being the Messiah while using the rabbinic timeline, which Nachmanides agreed that is the one that he follows as well. And the beat goes on all the way to the present day with rabbinic chronology still ultimately using the Seder Olam chronology that was produced in the mid-2nd century A.D.
Now I'm sure you're wondering, well, what about all the numerous Persian kings? Yeah, the rabbis will say there were actually only 4, maybe 5 in some cases. Which you're now wondering, well, where is Artaxerxes from the book of Nehemiah in there? Well, the Seder Olam says that Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes were all the same person, and lo and behold, so does the Talmud teach that they were all the same person. So, that's how you can reduce it down.
And going back to Rabbi Singer's chart is that you can see that he has only 4 Persian kings listed as well. Rabbi Simon Schwab took up this conflicting topic where he attempted to reconcile the matter, and in that process, he provided a survey where some well-known rabbinic commentators, like Rashi, typically listed only 4 Persian kings as well. So, I think you're starting to see that what the sages said in the 2nd century AD guided what the medieval rabbis taught, and that is still what is taught and believed today by 99% of rabbis as factual history, regardless of what the entire scholarly world has to say about it. Now, the reduction in the number of Persian kings is not the only reduction in kings you'll find in rabbinic chronology, because they also reduced the Babylonians down to only 3 kings, while history records that there were 6. So, rabbinic chronology eliminates 3 of them as well in both the Seder and the Talmud. Now, one thing that might have caught your attention earlier is that the Babylonian and exile 70-year period don't completely overlap one another. This takes us back to Skobac's reference to Jeremiah 25's 70 years covering Babylon's ruling period, which he then goes on saying that Jeremiah 29's 70-year period covers from the first temple destruction to the rebuilding of the second temple. So, the 2 70-year predictions by Jeremiah are not congruent, but are staggered. This is what you see from Rosenfeld as well, saying, in truth, the 2 70s of Jeremiah 25 and 29 were separate prophecies. Babylonia would fall 70 years after its ascension, and this had occurred the year before the events of Daniel 9, while the return to Zion would not occur until 70 years after Jerusalem's destruction, which occurred 18 years after Nebuchadnezzar's ascension. Now, this staggering of Jeremiah's 2 70-year predictions is huge because it's foundational to their entire system. And the way they explain their staggering is by saying that Daniel was anxious and erred in his interpretation that both prophecies were speaking of the same 70-year period. Rabbi Kravitz said, Daniel was confused because although he now witnessed that with the advent of Darius, the 70 years to the Babylonian subjugation were over in fulfillment of Jeremiah 25:11 through 12. Daniel had not yet seen the fulfillment of Jeremiah 29:10 that promised that after the 70 years the Jewish exiles would return and rebuild Jerusalem. The proof for Daniel's confusion over Jeremiah's 70 years is with the word understood, because this type of translation makes it read like Daniel understands what's really going on here. Whereas the true sense is that Daniel was trying to figure it out and was just jumping the gun too much. The funny thing is that Skobac used the word perceived in his video, although he said that's the wrong way to understand it. So, Daniel misinterpreted Jeremiah 29:10 according to the modern rabbis.
Right now, we have 6 pretty significant historical and interpretative differences between the rabbis and the rest of the world. As shown earlier, is that the rabbis will say that there are 2 Mashiachs in the prophecy. The first is Cyrus the Great. I have read some saying that Rabbi Arbanel in the 15th century suggested Nehemiah, but I couldn't find a primary source for that. So, you know where that can be retrieved, just please drop it in the comments section for me. And the second has 3 different proposals, with Agrippa II's death being the most often proposed of them.
So let's discuss their selection of Cyrus. The argument here comes in three pieces. The first will be pointing to 2 Chronicles and Ezra stating that Cyrus is fulfilling prophecy of Jeremiah. In their viewpoint is that they will say that this was fulfilling Jeremiah's first 70-year prophecy in 25:11 through 12, as Cyrus issued a proclamation saying, "Thus saith Cyrus, king of Persia, all the kingdoms of the earth has the Lord God of heaven given me, and he has charged me to build him an house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah." The key phrase here is, "he has charged me." This draws the attention of the reader to Isaiah's Cyrus prophecy, where it says that Cyrus shall perform of all God's pleasure, and part of that is the temple's reconstruction, which leads to the next piece in the argument, in that Isaiah 45:1 has God calling Cyrus his Mashiach. So, Cyrus being called a Mashiach in Isaiah, Ezra saying that he is fulfilling Jeremiah 25, and that when you take into account Jeremiah 52:12, that says it was the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar when the temple was destroyed, is that this means that Cyrus's first year came 52 years after Jerusalem was leveled to the ground. And this amount of years falls within the 7th week of years in the 70 weeks prophecy, thus proving that the Mashiach Nagid did come after 7 weeks and not 69.
So we can add to their interpretation that the first 7 weeks concluded with Cyrus 52 years later after the destruction of the temple, which is another chronology issue. And what you have probably realized by now is that their 70-week system is their chronology system. This is a classic case of realizing that Finkel is Einhorn, Einhorn is Finkel. With that said, is that if you know these historical views of theirs and how to show that none of them are factual, is that then you have refuted their 70-week system from the outset. So, to any potential conservative or Orthodox Jew listening out there, is that yes, I will address all the translation issues that are presented by the rabbis that they claim Christians and primarily the KJV translators get wrong. I fully understand how all these factors are interwoven between each other, but at the end of the day, if your view on history and when events took place is shown to be completely bunk, is that none of your other arguments matter because your system has no real merit to it. You have to realize that a key strategy here of the rabbis is to first tear down the messianic interpretation and just rail against it for a substantial amount of their presentation, because they want to grind it into your head that Christians have no clue of what they're talking about. And if you then buy into that, then you'll start to think that, finally when the rabbis present their position, is that they must have the correct one. No, that does not hold up logically. Just because you can prove that one system is wrong doesn't then make your viewpoint or their viewpoint the correct one. No differently than if I were to show you that one political party is corrupt, is that it doesn't then make the other one righteous. So let's address their historical viewpoint of the Babylonians and Persians, then tackle their Jeremiah and first 7 weeks length interpretations, and after that we'll have some bonus rabbinic material that the counter-missionary rabbis will probably, and I've never seen them, bring up in their presentations, and you'll see why. First, with the Babylonian Empire, is that you can see that there are significant differences between the two lists in the number of kings that ruled and also the lengths of their rule with Nebuchadnezzar and especially evil Merodach. So is there evidence for the 3 missing kings from the rabbinic list? The answer is yes. Because back in our Daniel 5 study, when we showed how bogus the critics' old claim that Belshazzar never existed,
is that the same evidence there demonstrates that Nabonidus was a Babylonian king and father of Belshazzar. Other archaeological evidence for Nabonidus is the Persian verse account of his in the British Museum, where he recounts giving full authority to his firstborn son, Belshazzar. Next, from the Yale Babylonian collection, is the interpretation of the Nabonidus dream, where he calls Belshazzar the crown prince. And Cyrus alluded to Belshazzar on the famous Cyrus Cylinder that a coward was put in charge as the king of this country, which would be indirectly referring to Nabonidus as the one who put him in charge. And if you go onto the British Museum site, is that you can find numerous bricks with his name recorded on them, and a stela of him praying to the moon god Sin. So, Nabonidus can be easily checked off as a real person and a historical king of Babylon. For Negal-Sharezer, who is mentioned in Jeremiah 39:13 as a Babylonian official, is that he can be found in a good number of inscriptions as well. So he too can be checked off, and since his son ruled for such a short period of time, is that nothing to my knowledge has been found coming directly from him or, say, from Nabonidus who overthrew him. But you will find him on ancient kings lists that provides the lengths of their rules. Obviously, column 5 over there is, just provided to us for the BC dates. But for now, you can see that the rabbis were in error to limit the Babylonian Empire to only 3 kings, which means that their reigning lengths for Nebuchadnezzar and Evil Merodach are wrong as well. And if you're asking yourself, well, where from or how did the 2nd AD rabbis construct these numbers? Is that we'll unpack that, but it's going to be towards the end of the video, and you'll see why. Next is the Persian Empire period. The orange line is where both sides say that Alexander conquered Persia, and you can see even there is a 12 to 13 year difference between them. Now, conventional chronology would say here's how the post-exilic biblical books would line up with the Persian period, or Persian kings, that is. Rabbinic chronology has the book of Esther coming after Ezra 1 through 3. Then comes Ezra 4 through 6, Haggai, and Zechariah. The explained shift here in name is that Darius then started to be referred to as Artaxerxes for the remaining of the book of Ezra and all of Nehemiah. And when you look at the referenced years of their reigns, is that you can see that they are continuous. Also, some rabbis might throw in Daniel 11, 1 through 3 at you. It says, "Also I in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I, stood to confirm and to strengthen him. And now will I show ye the truth. Behold, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia. And the 4th shall be far richer than they all, and by his strength through his riches he shall stir up all against the realm of Greece. And a mighty king shall stand up, that shall rule with great dominion, and do according to his will." So the rabbinic argument will say, look, Daniel 11 predicted that there would be 4 total Persian kings. Then comes a Greek king who will conquer them, which we all know is Alexander the Great. So, if you go with your heathen list, is that you are consequently saying that the Bible is wrong. So we will stick with Hashem and his word. Now, if that has rattled your cage at all, let me add one more potential that could be used to justify the equating of Darius and Artaxerxes. Ezra 4 opens up talking about how rebuilding the temple under Zerubbabel and Joshua the high priest was met with resistance by some adversaries. Verse 5 says that this took place from Cyrus to Darius. The catch here is that verse 6 talks about those adversaries writing to King Ahasuerus about rebuilding that's going on in Judah and Jerusalem. Then in verse 7, it describes later on others writing to Artaxerxes and complaining about the rebuilding as well. The whole letter is contained in verses 8 through 23. But in the final verse it says, "Then ceased the work of the house of God, which is at Jerusalem. So it ceased unto the 2nd year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia." So it appears that either Artaxerxes comes before Darius, or what the rabbis would say is that this shows that Artaxerxes and Darius are the same person, and that Ezra himself bounced back and forth between their names to show this equation.
So if we're going to show non-believing Jews or potentially rabbis that their Persian time frame is wrong, is that we have to coherently show why their interpretation in Ezra and that of Daniel 11:1-4 are wrong. Then we can present some evidence that affirms the conventional list again. So, going back to Ezra 4, is that the narrative about the temple rebuilding struggles didn't end there. Chapter 5 opens up again with Zerubbabel and Joshua getting pressed by the prophets Haggai and Zechariah to keep rebuilding the temple. Verse 3 gives us some names of those who opposed them, but they didn't care and continued on unless the matter was going to be taken up by King Darius himself. So, the adversary sent a letter to Darius. They explained that what was going on and requested for Darius to search the king's treasure house if Cyrus really made a decree to allow the Jews to rebuild their temple. Remember, the king of Persia cannot revoke prior law, even his own. Now, chapter 6 explains how Darius found Cyrus's decree and read it out loud. He then said that the adversaries are to go nowhere near the Jews and cause them any more problems. The decree finishes describing all of the additional help and resources that Darius is going to throw in, with verse 13 saying that the adversaries did so speedily. Now, here comes the big verse for us, verse 14. "And the elders of the Jews built it, and they prospered through the prophesying of Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the son of Iddo. And they built it, and they finished it, according to the commandment of the God of Israel, and according to the commandment of Cyrus and Darius and Artaxerxes, king of Persia." Right there, Ezra distinguishes Darius from Artaxerxes by describing the 3 separate decrees. Yet, all of them reinforce the same permission of the rebuilding of the temple. And you will see this same distinguishing in modern Jewish translations. Another way we know that they're distinct from one another is by looking at the list of people who wrote a complaint letter unto the king. Nobody matches up between the 2 lists. These are 2 separate letters going to 2 different kings. If you try to make them be the same king, you have to argue that they had to repeatedly keep making royal decrees to stop their people from harassing the Jews in the same 2nd year. Sorry, that is just simply poor thinking, or really lack thereof. But what about chapter 4's appearance of Ahasuerus and Artaxerxes coming before Darius? That can be explained with the idea that verses 6 through 23 are a parenthetical comment added in by Ezra. It's him inserting a comment about other examples of them being persecuted while they're trying to rebuild their cities and homes. Cyrus and Darius are only concerned with the temple. So, if you want to have it chronologically arranged, is that it would look like this. But Ezra wrote it this way because he then continued on from verse 24, telling the sequential story of the resumption of the rebuilding of the temple in the 2nd year of Darius in chapters 5 and 6. Now, look how chapter 7 opens up. Now after these things, in the reign of Artaxerxes, king of Persia, you can tell that Ezra is moving forward in time to himself. And not just by a year, as the rabbis would say. Because it makes no sense to think that the few thousands of people that returned under Zerubbabel fell so fast after finishing the temple to mixed marriages with foreigners that then Ezra had to go there himself and end them in just 1 year's time. Again, that is poor thinking about the context. But still, we should address that transitional phrase because on JudaismAnswered.com's article on Daniel 9 is that it says that it indicates a short period of time in the Tanakh, i.e. the Old Testament. That Hebrew phrase occurs 14 times as a transition point in the historical books. So, basically, are there any instances where this is used as referencing an extended period of time that has passed and now new events are about to take place? I'm not going to go over all of these, but I hope that 3 of them should be adequate enough for you. First, we're going to zero in on Genesis 22, as it should be a familiar chapter to us all. Here is the story of Isaac almost being sacrificed on the altar. Chapter 21 is his birth, him being weaned, then a short story about Abraham forming a covenant with Abimelech. The Talmud says that weaning took place between 2 months to 5 years old. The question now is, how old was Isaac at Mount Moriah? I personally take a 30-ish year old approach for various reasons, which would then show the gap in time between the 2 chapters. But the Seder jumps in here with its own interpretation, saying that he was 7. So they would argue against me on that, and you know what? So be it. Because the next after these things comes right after the sacrifice story in verse 20. This transitions the reader to chapter 23, opening statement that Sarah died at the age of 127. Because of that, is that it means that Isaac is 37 years old at the time of her death, since she was 90 years old when she gave birth to him. Thus, we are launched forward by 30 years with the phrase, after these things, in verse 20. Next, we are going down to the post-exilic example in Esther. 2:1 indicates that it was the 6th year of Ahasuerus, as Esther did a full year of beauty and pregnancy test school before coming into the king's chambers in his 7th year. Esther 1 is placed in his 3rd year, so we have a 3-year difference. Not huge, but not immediately after either. Chapter 3's use can't be pegged with Haman's promotion, but verse 7 says that Haman's plot started to take place in the 12th year, so a 5 to 6 year gap is very likely taking place here. Again, it's demonstrating that after these things doesn't necessarily mean a short period of time. And our last example that we're going to cover is with 2 Chronicles, whose author both the rabbis and conservative Christians would say was Ezra. So, if this example shows a good amount of time passing coming from the same author, then Ezra 7:1 can no longer be used as a proof text by the rabbis in their attempt to equate Darius with Artaxerxes. 2 Chronicles 32 is the story of King Sennacherib of Assyria's invasion of Judah, where the angel of the Lord wiped out 185,000 Assyrians in one night to save Jerusalem. The 3 chapters before this cover Hezekiah's reforms. 29:3 states that it was in the 1st year that he started doing this. And chapters 30 and 31 show that those events in those chapters were still in the 1st year of his reign. So, when did Sennacherib invade Judah? Well, 2 Chronicles doesn't state it, but 2 Kings 18:13 does,
and it says that it was in the 14th year of his reign. So there you go. The same author of Ezra 7:1 used the phrase, after these things, with a 13-year gap coming between the events of chapters 29 through 31 and 32. With that now dismissed, we can see that with Ezra 6:14 and the whole scope of the book is why the equating of the two kings fails. But before moving on to Daniel 11, is that Judaism Answers article says that Esther 2:5 states that Mordecai went into exile with King Jehoiachin in 3327. This is another important date and event that we'll come back to when we demonstrate how the Seder constructed the regnal years for the Babylonian and Persian kings. Since it's the 8th year of Nebuchadnezzar, is that this comes 11 years before the temple's destruction. So the argument goes that if Mordecai was exiled on this year, is that conventional chronology now makes Mordecai over 112 years old, and that's only if he was an infant when exiled. Obviously, this sounds absurd and might make the conventionalists start to doubt, but let's do what we always do here. Check the scripture. Here's what Esther 2:5 through 6 says. Now in Susa, the palace, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Yehur, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captivity which had been carried away with Jehoiachin, or Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. So, the rabbis are taking verse 6's exile statement to Mordecai. What the rabbis are doing is skipping over the genealogy to connect the exile statement with him, where verse 6 could and should be read as referring to Mordecai's great-grandfather Kish as the one who was exiled with Jehoiachin. And why it should be read that way is because of verse 7 saying, and Mordecai brought up Hadassah, can't believe I got that wrong. That is, Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother, and the maid was fair and beautiful, whom Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took for his own daughter. Now, did you catch the relation there? Mordecai is Esther's cousin. And if so, then they are going to be close in their age to one another, which makes Mordecai be somewhere between 20 to 40, as Esther would be in her young teens. So, Esther 2:5 through 7 and its context doesn't support the rabbinic view, but actually challenges it, because even if you go with a young Mordecai, like being around 20 at the time of Ahasuerus, is that it takes place, his birth during evil Merodach's reign, leaving 50 or so years left to have 3 generations fitting between his birth and Jehoiachin's exile. It's doable, but you have to argue that Kish had Shimei right after being exiled to Babylon. I know this really sounds weedy and speculative, but this is how scholars imagine things playing out in their minds to try to make their system sound doable. Regardless, we proved our point that Esther 2:5 through 7 doesn't support the rabbinic view, but actually works very nicely with 4 generations spanning 80 to 100 years. So, let's now cover Daniel 11's opening verses. The first thing to understand is that the rabbis are interpreting this as though the 4th Persian king is going against the mighty Greek king that is to come. And Judaism Answers says that this will happen soon because of Daniel 10:20. And since everyone knows that Alexander the Great is the mighty Greek king,
that the rabbis will say that this is why there was only 3 Persian kings starting with Cyrus from Daniel 11:2. Why that is wrong is because Daniel 11 through 12, the last 2 chapters in the book, are part of the same final revelation given to Daniel that started in chapter 10, which is dated to the 3rd year of Cyrus. And looking at 11:1 is that Gabriel is reflecting upon how he supported and strengthened Darius the Mede 2 years earlier. Then shifts to telling Daniel what is coming in the future, which he says 3 more Persian kings will come, and that the 4th king is going to be the richest, and he is going to stir up a lot of fighting with the Greeks. So, on the conventional list, you can see that the 4th king is Xerxes. And his stirring up and fighting with the Greeks is exactly what you see in history with the Greco-Persian Wars. The most famous battles are the Battle of Marathon, where the legend surrounding it has a Greek runner running from Marathon to Athens and yells, "Nike!" the Greek word for victory. And the Battle of Thermopylae with the 300 Spartans under King Leonidas. Then, in verse 3, is that the mighty Greek king that stands up is looking further down the line in history that will conquer the Persian Empire. Now, quickly look at verse 4. And when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken, and shall be divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, and not to his posterity, nor according to his dominion, which he ruled. For his kingdom shall be plucked up, even for others beside those. The shall be broken broken language immediately takes us back to chapter 8, with the notable horn being broken, and the 4 kingdoms arising during the Diadochi Wars that ensue thereafter. The main point here is that Daniel 11:2 should make you think of the bear and ram representing the Medo-Persian Empire conquering all of the Near East. But what the rabbis fail to note in their system is that Gabriel told Daniel that the 2 horns are 2 concurrent ruling kings from the aligned empire. So, Daniel 8:20 is the Bible's 3rd strike on the rabbinic list of Persian kings.
Now, some rabbis might recognize Cyrus and Darius as co-regents and compensate for it by stretching the beginning and ending of some years of those 4 Persian kings. But, that just, doesn't really matter still. But let's now provide some external evidence that supports the conventional list.
The first notable difference is with how many years Cyrus was said to rule after conquering Babylon. The rabbinic view gives him at most 3 years because of its reference in Daniel 10:1. The conventional view gives him typically somewhere between 9 and 10 years because Parker and Dubberstein point out repeated archaeological proofs for the start and end of each of the kings that ruled over Babylon. Here you can see that Cyrus conquered in 539 and his last mentioned year is 530. Cyrus's death is pretty debated, but the year in which his reign ends is dated in 530 because when you move down to Cambyses is that he begins to be called king shortly after Cyrus's last mentioning. And don't ever forget about the Greek historians like Herodotus, Thucydides, Xenophon, and others that place it in the same year as well. An important piece can be retrieved from the book Ancient Near Eastern Texts Relating to the Old Testament, often referred to simply as Anet. On page 316, under Cyrus, that an inscription on a clay barrel reads, "Marduk, the great lord, was well pleased with my deeds and sent friendly blessings to myself. Cyrus, the king who worships him, to Cambyses, my son, the offspring of my loins." So there you have Cyrus referring to Cambyses as his son and would be the heir to the throne and evidence that he was in fact a king of the Persian Empire. So, under the Rabbinic view, he didn't even exist. So they're wrong again. Then you have Smyrna in the list for only 7 to 9 months typically. Again, you can refer to the Babylonian Chronology book for dates, but the one piece of evidence that we should all lock into our heads is the massive Behistun inscription done by Darius the Great. On there are descriptions of 19 battles conducted by Darius the Great, with the last one in December of 521 BC. Looking closer is that you see Darius standing on one of his defeated foes. An inscription there reads, "This is Gamada, the Magian. He lied, saying, 'I am Smyrna, the son of Cyrus, I am king.'" Again, there are alternative views on this. Maybe that Darius was lying and that it really was Cyrus' second son, or, as he said, an actual imposter. Regardless, is that there are multiple accounts saying that Cyrus had 2 sons, and that he, or an imposter, ruled for the short period of time between Cambyses and Darius the Great. Now, the last 3 have another big difference to them, and it involves who is whose actual father. The rabbis are not going to bring up that kind of information because they have Ahasuerus as possibly being Cyrus's son and Darius being the son of Ahasuerus. Back on the Behistun inscription is that Darius gives his lineage. And the reason why is because he wasn't Cyrus's son, but needed to prove that he was of royal descent. So his genealogy demonstrates that he is a descendant of the Achaemenid family. He describes that, and also that he is the 9th king of this royal family. Another fun one is the Darius seal, where he calls himself the Great King. Maybe this is where we get the whole Darius the Great thing from. Now, to solidify his claim to the throne is that he marries one of Cyrus's daughters, Atassa, and they together had Xerxes the Great. How we know that Xerxes is the son of Darius is by going back to Annette and their reference to an Akkadian tablet that reads, "I am Xerxes the Great, the only king, the king of all countries which speak all kinds of languages, the king of this entire big and far-reaching earth, the son of King Darius, the Kenemian, a Persian, son of a Persian, and an Aryan of Aryan descent." So you have Xerxes saying that Darius was his father. On Livius is that they make reference to an inscription slab that also has Xerxes saying Darius was his father, and continues with him mentioning the palace at Susa. The important piece there is that it's talking about the new main capital of the Persian Empire, which is reflected in Esther 1:2. And on another inscription, Xerxes describes all the places that he was ruling over, which is basically the entire Near East and some of Africa. The cross-reference here for us is Esther 1:1, describing the same expanse of territory that Ahasuerus ruled over. For these and many other reasons is why Ahasuerus is typically identified with Xerxes. Now, back on our genealogy chart is that secular history records Xerxes marrying Amestris. Together, they had 3 sons, of which Artaxerxes I is the youngest. The 2 older brothers were either killed by the same assassin of Xerxes, or possibly Artaxerxes did it himself. Either way, they were snuffed out, and he took over the throne after Xerxes was murdered. On an inscription by Artaxerxes, he says that he was the son of Xerxes and grandson of Darius from the Achaemenid family, thus refuting the rabbinic order of kings and the equating of Darius with Artaxerxes. But before we move on, is that I want to present one final argument that I think completely ends the debate over these 2 lists, and that is tombs. Royal tombs, in fact. Each of these kings
other than Smyrna or Pseudo-Smyrna, have a royal burial tomb that can be viewed today. And just to add insult to injury, here is Darius II's tomb, as he was the son of that Artaxerxes I that eventually got the throne after his two other brothers were out of the way. And because of all these examples, and many, many others, is that Rabbi Schwab acknowledged this and said the following: "These Babylonian and Persian figures can hardly be doubted, for they appear to be the result of painstaking research by hundreds of scholars and are borne out by profound erudition and by ever-increasing authoritative evidence." So when Rabbi Kravitz said there's limited archaeological discoveries attesting to the Babylonian kings, is that he made that statement in either total ignorance or that he has an agenda at hand. Take your pick.
Now, with all of that settled, has the ripple effect started to take place in your mind? Because since we show that Darius and Artaxerxes are different people, and that the conventional list is the reliable list, is that then that means that the Persian period starts earlier. Now, I know I only moved it a little bit, but I want all the information to remain on the screen for you. Now, since we moved the start of the Persian period earlier, is that then this means that the whole Babylonian period must be shifted back as well. And if that is shifted back, then their date for the start of the exile and the first temple destruction has to be shifted back too, which means that the length of the second temple period is now longer than 420 years, thus proving that rabbinic chronology has no historical basis. But not just that, because then their verse 25 starting point has to be shifted back as well, which puts them into a catch-22. Because now they have a gap in their system, which they're not going to allow in, and so they are forced to make a decision. Because the only way for them to close this gap off and maintain a 490-year continuous system ending with the Second Temple's destruction is to declare that either their whole explanation and interpretation for staggering Jeremiah's 270-year prophecies, Daniel being confused and Gabriel coming to start cleaning things up for him, and that it all came with a God sent forth a word from heaven, is all wrong, to allow for the 70 weeks to remain continuous and finish with the Second Temple destruction. But if they do this, is that they would have to start arguing, like most Christian commentators, that the starting point is one of the Persian king's decrees that is described in Ezra and Nehemiah. And they're not going to like to do that. But if they don't want to give up on their starting point, is that the only other option is to say that their 70th week doesn't end with the Second Temple's destruction and would have to shift the 70th week back. Starting to see what the big deal is here. It's that their proposals for who the second Mashiach crumbles away now, and the date by which you are looking for a viable candidate subsequently shifts back as well. And the more that the Persian period is shown to be longer in time frame, or the Greek one for that matter, is that this eventually has all the shifting, moving their 70-week system further and further back to where the second Mashiach's date eventually overlaps Jesus' crucifixion. Now, to any believer out there watching, is that you got to be smiling at this right now. But to any Jewish person that is watching, is that what I just said is what? Logical. If the Persian and or Greek period is longer in time frame, is that the only way that you can avoid the second Mashiach not being dated during Jesus' ministry is that you have to say that the starting point is not with the first temple's destruction, but then every explanation that the rabbis give you for starting it there is now wrong as well. And I truly understand the imperatives that come with that recognition, because all that is left at this point is the rabbi's interpretation that Daniel was wrong when he was reading Jeremiah, and how they calculated where the first 7 weeks end. Because when you see how all this is done, is that it might finally click in your head as to exactly what the 2nd AD rabbis were coming up with all this. Now, take note that what the rabbis are saying is that Daniel believed that Jeremiah 25 and 29 were speaking of the same time period, but that it was wrong on his part to think that they were the same. Mind you, that this is only the holy inspired prophet that is greatly beloved by God, who received and understood chapters 2, 7, and 8 visionary symbolic prophecies, somehow got kerplunked when it came to Jeremiah's 70 years that he heard live and read himself and even lived through. All right, let's roll with it and just see what happens. The first 7 weeks are synced at the end of the Babylonian period with Cyrus and his decree to rebuild the temple. The 52 years calculation is done by subtracting the 18 years of Nebuchadnezzar from the 70-year prophecy. Now, did you catch that? If not, you'll see what I'm getting at here. Back at the beginning of our Chapter 9 study, we addressed the 70 years of desolation. There, we addressed the critics' attack that the 70-year prophecy failed because it was only 66 to 67 years that their captivity really lasted and not the full 70. We had to get into the weeds to show that the prophecy didn't fail after taking into consideration the accession counting method and that the new regnal year started in the spring, that the 70th year then has a span as such on the timeline. Then overlaying Darius the Mede's reorganization of the empire with Cyrus's decree occurring towards the very end of his first year, that the first caravan returnees arrived in Jerusalem during the 70th year window, thus fulfilling Jeremiah's prophecy. So, you're wondering, what's the point that I'm trying to make here? The point is that the approach taken between the two sides is completely opposite of one another. Still confused? Don't worry, I struggled for a long time trying to find the words to express what I mean exactly by that. And honestly, the best way for that statement to make sense is to show you this at work. Earlier, we made mention of the different lengths of reigns that the two lists have, which likely sparked the question in your head, where did the 2nd AD rabbis get these numbers from? Now, the conventionalists will likely point out things like the Sumerian king list and many other records that show the same list of kings and years. The rabbis will accuse a Christian for siding with the pagans and not the Bible. The problem with that type of thinking is that when you look at the Bible alone, is that the last tagged year for Nebuchadnezzar is his 23rd year in Jeremiah 52:30. For evil Merodach, there's only one verse that mentions him, and it speaks of his first year that is synced with the 37th year of Jehoiachin's captivity in Babylon. And for Belshazzar, his first and third years are mentioned at the beginning of the prophetic chapters. So, how did the Talmudists come up with these numbers? Because both Nebuchadnezzar and evil Merodach are short by 22 years, and nowhere does it discuss their deaths in the Bible. Nebuchadnezzar's 45 can be constructed by adding 2 Kings 24:12's reference to his eighth year being when he took Jehoiachin captive. So, since the 37th year of Jehoiachin's captivity was when evil Merodach took over, is that those two numbers can be added together to make 45. Now, this might sound like the Bible has 2 more years than the conventionalist, but it's really not, and we'll soon show why. But for now, just try to track how the rabbis are getting these numbers. So, you can biblically make 45 years for Nebuchadnezzar, but did you see that this leaves Amel-Marduk without any Bible verses to now use? And this is where the opposite approach starts to come into play. To get Amel-Marduk for 23 years and Belshazzar for 2 years is that you have to use Jeremiah's prophecy as your base. So what's left in the time for Babylon? 25 years. Then they'll state that since the last reference to Belshazzar is in Daniel 8:1 referring to his third year, is that 2 full years can be assumed that he ruled before the fall of Babylon. Then subtract those 2 years off of 25, and you get Amel-Marduk ruling for 23 years. Did any alarm bells go off for you there? Folks, they are now guilty of arbitrarily making up these numbers. Well, how so? Because it looks kind of biblical-ish. Their giant assumption is that the fall of Babylon took place in Belshazzar's 3rd year. There is no regnal year or sinking verses in Daniel 5, so they are forcing Daniel 5 to take place in his 3rd year. So the only reason why Amel-Marduk is 23 years is because that's what was left over. So if the Talmudists would have gave Belshazzar his 3rd year, then Amel-Marduk would have been 22. Or say randomly gave Belshazzar 10 or 15, then Amel would be 10. Folks, they are making up history as it suits their purpose, because without the secular records is that there is no basis for giving Amel-Marduk 23 years when all that is in the Bible is a reference to his 1st year. But look at the inconsistency that's already taking place in how they choose to slap down their numbers. Originally, they told us to use the referenced years to total for Nebuchadnezzar, but then said for Belshazzar only use 2, even though a 3rd is referenced. And guess what? They did this earlier as well when they told us to subtract 18 years off, not 19, off of the 70-year prophecy to calculate how much longer the Babylonians ruled. The point that I'm trying to get across is that they are starting with the prophecy, then declaring how history played out. You can't do that. But sadly, this type of inconsistent and irrational decision-making continues on with their reduced Persian period of 52 years that is directly tied to their Second Temple 420-year view. But before moving into that, did you catch how the biblical length for Nebuchadnezzar's reigns actually lines up perfectly with a conventional list? Because instead of taking the longest time frame with the 8th and 37th years, is that adding their total given factual years gives you exactly 43 years. That shows once again that biblical and Neo-Babylonian history validate one another. And the small numbers are justified, as the Jerusalem Chronicle indicates that Nebuchadnezzar took Jehoiachin captive in mid-March, which is the starting month of the new year. Oh yeah, people. There's gobs of this stuff that corroborates the Bible. But if you're still struggling how they got their Babylonian numbers, please go back and watch it again, because this next segment covers the rest of their timeline from Persia to the Second Temple's destruction, and there are many because this, therefore that, assumptions that get woven all together to contrive their timeline. Going back briefly to their Babylonian period is that we noted that Jeremiah 25's prophecy served as the base to figuring out Amel-Marduk's rabbinic number. Meaning that without the prophecy, there's no way that you can arrive at that number. So to say it another way, they're using their interpretation of the prophecy to make up history to prove their interpretation of the prophecy. Folks, that is circular reasoning at its finest. But for their 52-year Persian period is that it happens on a much more egregious scale. Because how they arrive at these figures in the equating of Darius with Artaxerxes starts with their presumption that their interpretation of all of Daniel 9 is correct. Again, this is circular reasoning because they're ultimately proving their view with their view. Because the only way that the rabbis can say that the Second Temple was destroyed in the year 3829 from creation is by using their interpretation of Daniel 9 to link the two events. There is no way that you can date the Second Temple destruction from creation without doing this. Remember, they refuse to use Babylonian, Persian, and Greek records that describe this period, and they'll even throw Josephus under the bus because he used those records
to describe the span between the two temple destructions. So, because of their interpretation that involves saying that Daniel erred in his understanding of Jeremiah 29:10, and that it was an allusion to the 70 weeks, starting with the first temple destruction, is that they subtract Jeremiah 29:10's 70 years off of the 490 total to declare that the second temple stood for 420 years. So maybe now what I'm trying to get synced into your heads is starting to really make sense. Their whole chronology is based upon their interpretation of Daniel 9. Because without saying Daniel was wrong, is that Jeremiah 29:10's 70 years would be shifted back by 18 years to be congruent with Jeremiah 25's 70 years. Now, this shift would cause an avalanche of problems for the rabbis to now deal with, because their whole explanation about Gabriel clearing things up for Daniel goes out the window, and they can no longer say that Jeremiah 29:10 is embedded or tied directly to the 70 weeks prophecy. And as such, they would theologically shoot themselves in the foot with that, because Daniel 9:1 is dated within their 70 weeks interpretation, and that negates the whole idea of predictive prophecy for the first 7 weeks ending with Cyrus. So they would start to sound a lot like the critics with these prophecies being written down after the fact. So are you starting to see how all this is tied to their view that Daniel erred and the staggering of Jeremiah 25 and 29? Because if we demonstrate that they should be aligned together, is that it dominoes everything else that the rabbis teach regarding the 70 weeks and the Talmud, because they theologically must move the prophecy to the first year of Darius to preserve predictive prophecy. But with that, they have to say that the Talmud, the Seder Olam, and all their famous rabbis were all wrong to say that the second temple stood for 420 years. This demonstrates again that they are making history up based upon their interpretation of these prophecies. But before turning the canons in that direction, is that we are going to move things back to the way that they interpret it so that we can see how they arrive at those numbers for the Persian period. Remember, their restriction for only 4 kings was how they choose to interpret Daniel 11:1-3. And that this is, again, another example of their interpretation of a prophecy determining what happened in history according to them. The first 18 years happens within that box of time. The additional layer to this are the 3 references to the temple's reconstruction being halted until the second year of Darius. The catch here is that Zechariah 1:12 says that the second year of Darius is the 70th year after Jerusalem was destroyed, and that the Seder Olam referenced Zechariah 1:12 as well. So, Darius' second year must fall at the 18th year of the Persians in their system, which they would say only 1 full year has passed, leaving 17 years to fit 3 kings in based upon their interpretation of Daniel 11:1-3. And they do this by saying that Darius gets 1 year, or maybe a fraction of a year. Cyrus gets 2 full years, and maybe up to a third, leaving up to 14 years for Ahasuerus to fill up, just like they did with Amel Marduk, even though that the last referenced year for Ahasuerus is his 12th year. So in some cases, they limit the king's rules based upon the Bible, and other times they give them more than what the Bible says, because they have to make it appear as though it fits all perfectly together within all their prophetic interpretations. Now, why they gave the Persians only 34 more years of rule requires us to zoom back out, because we have to work in reverse from the Second Temple's destruction. I'm going to add back in all the other information and dates to help everyone's mental timeline flow with all this stuff. Now, the 70 AD date is really no longer disputed between the two sides. Yes, I've seen where some rabbis have 68 or 69 AD, but 70 is the 99% view today. Another agreeable date is Pompey's annexation of the Seleucids in 63 BC. And the final is 312 BC as the year when the Seleucid era started. Rabbis will also call this the era of contracts, as official documents were dated to the year of the Seleucids, just like we've seen in 1st and 2nd Maccabees. All you have to do is subtract the given number off of 312 to find the Gregorian date. So it's only a 6-yearish period that is disputed, as they are placing Alexander's conquest of Persia roughly 13 years later than the conventional date. So a better way to see the Greek period is 6 plus 174, because it's in this 40-year span where the 166 years are primarily gutted out because the Seleucid era to the Second Temple destruction is so locked in. And the reason why the Greek period is reduced is because the rabbis must allot their Darius II a minimum of 30 more full years from the second year in which the temple resumed its reconstruction. Let's zoom in just in case you got a little confused by all that. We just saw how Darius' second year was the 70th year from the first temple destruction. So, at minimum, 1 full year has gone by. Now, because of Nehemiah 13:6's reference to his 32nd year, is that 30 more years have to be added on. So a total of 100 years has now been used up under the rabbinic system, leaving 390 years left in the 490 years from the 70-week prophecy. And after you total up the Seleucid era to the Second Temple, is that you get 380 years. So all that's left is 10 years for them to use. Zooming in again, is that we split the Greek period up to 6 plus 174 because the Seleucid period is the 174, and the rabbis say that 6 years earlier was when Alexander the Great conquered the Persians. The overlap is because the Seder Olam says he ruled for a total of 12 years, but the 6 is discussed in Avodah Zarah 10a that he only ruled over the entire world for the last 6 years of those 12. So that leaves 4 years left that they give to the Persians and their Darius II. And that is how they contrived all the numbers for their Persian Empire period.
So basically, the disputed period is between Alexander's conquest of Persia and the agreed upon 312 BC date. So, what evidence is there that Alexander conquered Persia in 330 BC and not the rabbinic date of 317 BC? Well, like all conventional dates, is that they're established after taking into consideration the whole body of historical documents and current archaeological findings, is that they're weighed against one another, see where they agree, where's the little bit of differences, and try to reconcile all those, see if the time frames are realistic, and so on and so forth. And with all that type of minutia work that goes into it, is that these are the dates for his conquering of the Near East and his death in 323 BC, after which the partitioning of the empire took place. We've discussed how it was split up, but notice that only the Macedonian Empire started on the 323 BC date, while the others are established later. The reason is because the partition wasn't simply, okay, there goes the whole unified empire hope, we quit, let's just split up this into force now. What happened was Perdiccas was named regent of the empire, not king, but regent, and 4 generals were appointed as military satraps over the 4 territories. Now, why none of these were named king was because 2 others held that title, Alexander IV and Philip III. Alexander IV was Alexander the Great's son. The thing is that he was born right after Dad died. So there's royal blood available, but since he's an infant, is that you need somebody to still act like, the head of state. Philip III is the half-brother of Alexander the Great and was, quote-unquote, king, but he was mentally ill as well. The main thing here is that these two have minted coins of them. So they obviously existed and came between the time of Alexander the Great and the Seleucid era beginning in 312 BC. Because these two weren't normal ruling kings, is that some of the generals saw it as a time to seize more power, and with that, kick-started the civil wars between them by forming new alliances with each other that led to another war, and so on and so forth. It's in 312 BC that the Battle of Gaza takes place as Ptolemy and Seleucus align themselves to take on Demetrius I. After this victory is where the Seleucid era begins. So, history alone shows that the rabbinic dating for Alexander the Great is wrong. And you can see the gap between Alexander the Great and Seleucus on the reverse side of the king list that we saw earlier. And as for pinning down Alexander's death in the year 323 BC, is that the Babylonian Astronomical Diaries contain a fragment that records in great detail the star and lunar alignments of the night that Alexander died. It was a little cloudy, so exactly if it was June 10th or 11th is, we don't know for sure, but it's one of the two. Before moving on, is that there's a grave historical error that the Talmud made with this contrivance that runs in opposition with the Bible. And that deals with the Talmud's statement that Alexander ruled in Elam for 6 years before conquering the whole world. It's the location of Elam that we are going to put them into a catch-22. Because you can see that those 6 years are Artaxerxes' last 6 years. So that this would be his 28th through 34th year according to the rabbis. But here's their ghastly error. Elam is Susa. And we know this because Daniel 8:2 said that Susa was in the province of Elam. That can be seen here on the map. After Cyrus conquered Susa, he renamed the province Elam to Caesarea. After this, it became one of the capitals of the Persian Empire. So, to conquer Susa, i.e. Elam, is to conquer Persia. Nehemiah 1:1. In the 20th year, as I, Nehemiah, was in Susa the palace. So, Nehemiah asked Artaxerxes in Susa, i.e. Elam, to go to Jerusalem to fix it up, which would be 8 years before Alexander is said to have conquered it, according to the rabbis. The problem is that Nehemiah 13:6 says that Nehemiah came unto the king again in the 32nd year, which is in complete contrast to what the Talmud taught about Alexander's conquest. So once again, we don't even need to go to all the secular evidence to prove that the Seder Olam and the Talmud are wrong. All we need is just Scripture.
So we get to cross off their Greek Empire view as well, which takes us to the cornerstone of their whole system. As shown many times, is that their chronology is based upon how they choose to interpret Jeremiah 25 and 29 by staggering them along with the insertion that Daniel erred in his understanding. And I think by now you understand how interwoven all of these interpretations are of theirs and the domino effect that happens when just one of their views is shown to be wrong. But let's say that we just didn't get done demolishing all their chronological and historical views, and that this was the starting point for us, is that by showing they're the same, is that the rabbis would also have to admit that their claim that Daniel erred is wrong as well, and move the start of the 70 weeks forward to at least the present point in Daniel 9:1. with both of these shifts is that this clearly demonstrates that the Seder Olam, the Talmud, and the rabbis are wrong in saying that the Second Temple stood for only 420 years. And also that their view of Cyrus being the Mashiach Nagid fails because it's now 49 years later than his proclamation. Now you might think, okay, but could they shift Jeremiah 25:11 through 12 forward and keep their 70 weeks view? The answer is no, for the same reasons in the other direction. The Seleucid era started in 312 is a brick wall. There is absolutely no way that they could get gut out years from this point going forward to 70 AD. So, moving Jeremiah 25 forward would have the Persian Empire overlapping the Seleucids by 12 years. And it also moves Cyrus forward to the end of the 70 years, which wouldn't allow for him to be called the Mashiach Nagid at the end of 7 weeks. And you can see that that prophetic person falls within the Babylonian period now too. So, this is not an option for them either, and therefore they must keep them staggered the way they do, because aligning the two refutes their system in either direction. So, demonstrating that these should be aligned blows up their entire system from the get-go. Now, in the Old Testament, there are 3 different writers who discuss Jeremiah's 70-year prophecy. The most obvious one is Daniel, that we're debating over right now. Another is Ezra in 2 Chronicles 36 and Ezra 1. The attempt there is to demonstrate that Ezra was referencing Jeremiah 29:10 being fulfilled in the first year of Cyrus. And the third is Jeremiah himself. The attempt there is to show that Jeremiah in chapter 29 was referencing chapter 25 in his letter, and that the prophecy was only speaking of the Babylonian period. Starting with Jeremiah 29:10 is that it says, "For thus saith the Lord, that after 70 years be accomplished at Babylon, I will visit you and perform my good word towards you in causing you to return to this place." So it's very apparent that God is talking about the captives at Babylon alone here, and that after those 70 years is that he will bring them back to Jerusalem. The opening verse is explicit in that Jeremiah is addressing the captives in Babylon, that is composed of 2 different exiled groups now, as verse 2 places the letter after the second siege that involved taking Jehoiachin captive to Babylon. Verse 4 reflects on that, with God telling them to stay put, make babies, and seek the peace of the city, because I cause you to be carried there. So it's God telling the people that your captivity is following my plan, and he goes on telling them, "For thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, let not your prophets and your diviners that be in the midst of you deceive you, neither hearken to your dreams which you cause to be dreamed. For they prophesy falsely unto you in my name. I have not sent them, says the Lord." So he is telling them to stop listening to these false prophets that are telling you that your time there will soon be over, and stop trying to make yourselves believe the same things. And this was a real issue because Jeremiah was dealing with it in Jerusalem, as chapter 28 shows Hananiah saying that God is going to bring everyone back, or trying to make a prophecy that everyone is going to come back within 2 years' time, including Jehoiachin. Jeremiah rebuked him and actually prophesied against him, saying that you're going to be the one that's going to die within 2 years. And that's what happened. So, like this, he had to tell those false prophets in Babylon to stop doing it, and everybody there to stop listening to them, because nobody is coming home early. With this context in mind is that it explains why the 70 years were stated in verse 10.
It was to remind them that they'll be there for the full 70 years that I, Jeremiah, told you 8 years ago were coming, because you weren't obeying God's commands nor listening to the prophets that he sent you. Therefore, thus saith the Lord of hosts, because you have not heard my words, behold, I will send and take all the families of the north, says the Lord, and Nebuchadnezzar the king of Babylon, my servant, and will bring them against this land. This land refers to Judah, as verse 11 speaks of Judah and the surrounding nations serving Babylon for 70 years. Then God is going to punish Babylon for their iniquity when they cross the line with him. They may have been his instrument to punish Judah, but it didn't mean that they didn't go beyond that and commit evil atrocities in the process. So, Jeremiah 29 perfectly complements Jeremiah 25 after taking into account the context. And you've seen clearly that there is no allusion in 29 about an additional 18 years or that it's going to go into another empire period where God would then finally bring them back after that. Which is why the 3rd BC Jewish translators for the Septuagint worded it as referring to the point when Babylon's 70 years were almost done, that God will come intervene and bring them back. They are obviously thinking of Cyrus's conquering here and his release of the captives to return back to Jerusalem, which launches us to Ezra's references in 2 Chronicles 36 and Ezra 1. Here in verse 20, it's about the third group of captives that were taken to Babylon, and that their time there would last until the reign of Persia, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, to fulfill the 70 years. This fulfillment occurred in the first year of Cyrus with his proclamation for the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. The rabbis will say, I get that, but that's only pointing to Jeremiah 25:11 through 12 and not to Jeremiah 29:10 as well. The reason why they're dead wrong about that is because Cyrus released the captives and allowed them to return to Jerusalem if they wished. And Ezra 2 opens up talking about those who chose to go up out of captivity. The dot connector to Jeremiah 29:10 lies a little further down, with Ezra saying that the captives came again unto Jerusalem. This is exactly what God said that would happen in 29:10, and that promise is not found in 25:11 through 12. That shows conclusively that Ezra was referencing 29:10 and saw its fulfillment in the first year of Cyrus. Which takes us to Daniel now. Here the rabbis admit that Daniel was thinking of Jeremiah 29:10 because of their concocted narrative that he was confused, and by Daniel saying that he read books, plural, the number of the years. This shows that he had both of Jeremiah's accounts in mind, as he likely heard the first one live in Jerusalem before being taken captive to Babylon, and that he would have received the second one in the letter and read it out loud to Nebuchadnezzar himself after his chapter 2 promotion, which makes it really hard then for rabbis to say that the word understood or perceived here is in the wrong sense, and that he should be worded, or that it should be worded, as he was in a state of confusion and still trying to figure things out. The Hebrew word that gets translated as understood is used 19 times in Daniel, where at the beginning it was used to brag about how smart he was in his youth and why that he was brought to Nebuchadnezzar's court for further education. In chapter 8, it's used in the sense that Daniel was trying to figure out what the ram signified after just being instantly translated from Babylon to Susa. Then, after the goat vision played out, Gabriel told Daniel that he'll make him understand all of it. The Hebrew form here is in the Hiphil that coincides with the context of just witnessing something brand new, and he needs Gabriel to help make him understand it. So, when Daniel wrote the book, he knew how to describe himself in a state of not knowing something completely, but he didn't do that in 9:2. So, when Gabriel arrived, he was responding to Daniel's prayer for basically the full restoration of the kingdom and informing him of a new prophecy that is now going to cover a 490-year period. So, in a nutshell, Gabriel said, "Yup, Jeremiah's 70 years are over, and that covered the Babylonian period. But that's only the first kingdom of the four. We are just starting the second one now, and this new prophecy is going to cover the rest of the Gentile kingdoms, with these 6 points being all accomplished by its end." So we've shown how all three Old Testament writers saw Jeremiah 25 and 29 speaking of the same time period. But there's one more way to say, sorry rabbis, you're wrong. And that is, by looking at the three references to Darius' second year, is that it's said to be linked with 70 years after the temple was destroyed. The question here is, what don't you see within any of these? There are no references to Jeremiah or his prophecy like we saw with Daniel or Ezra. If these three writers, including Ezra, saw the staggering, they would have made at least one mentioning that this was fulfilling Jeremiah. But they didn't, because they knew that it wasn't the case. So we can cross off those, but I left number 2 up there because I just couldn't resist not pointing out another error that they make with this. Rabbi Kravitz said that 52 years falls within the 7th week to justify the extra 3 years for Cyrus's arrival. And you'll hear this type of explanation from the rest as well. The error is that it doesn't fall within the 7th week. It falls within the 8th. If I asked, in which week of October does the 16th fall within, what would you say? You would say the 3rd week, because there are 5 weeks in October this year, and the 16th falls within the 3rd one. And guess what? You can do the same with the sabbatical year cycle leading to the Jubilee year, and see that the 52nd year falls within the 8th week, not the 7th. So, we have refuted every single point in their interpretation now. So now what? What else could there possibly be left to refute? Well, it's the fact that some rabbis do recognize that rabbinic chronology is not an accurate timeline, but still will teach that the Second Temple stood for only 420 years. Now, I know what you're already asking yourself. How could they possibly reconcile the two that way? Well, you do so by employing a concept called the hidden years. You see, Schwab fully recognized that conventional chronology is the more accurate timeline, but likely didn't want to throw out the rabbinic 70-week system, so he throws at us one final curveball into the discussion. He says, it may be safely assumed that Nehemiah came much earlier than Ezra to Jerusalem. He arrived in 386-85 BC in the 20th year of Artaxerxes II, who was called king of Babel in Nehemiah 13:6. Ezra the scribe arrived in the 7th year of Artaxerxes III, and together with Nehemiah in 351 BC, consecrated the walls of the holy city. Thus, the reconstruction of the Holy Temple is finally fully accomplished. At this historic moment, the period of the Second Temple lasting 420 years does officially begin, and the Second Commonwealth has been formally ushered in. The counting, which was suspended in 516 BC, can now be resumed in 351 BC, 165 years later. Now, if that was difficult to track, here's what Schwab did. He starts with two giant interpretative claims
that Nehemiah came before Ezra, and that Nehemiah should be dated within Artaxerxes II, not Artaxerxes I. Typically, the post-exilic book would line up as so, with Ezra arriving in the 7th year first, then Nehemiah coming in the 20th year in 445 BC, both of which falling in Artaxerxes I's reign. Now, with Schwab's proposal is that Nehemiah is placed in Artaxerxes II's reign, with Ezra following in Artaxerxes III's reign. What happens is that the 7th year of Artaxerxes III is 351, that if you add 420 years onto that date, is that you arrive at 70 AD, thus keeping the 420 years for the Second Temple intact. So he did date the First Temple's destruction in 587 or 586, the Second Temple completed in 517 or 516, for 70 years coming in between of them. But according to him, is that it wasn't fully completed until 351, when Ezra might have performed some ceremonial consecration act of the rebuilt city wall. And lo and behold, the difference between them is 166 years, and Schwab said that these years were intentionally veiled or hidden from us, and he appealed to that idea with Daniel 12:4, where Daniel was told to shut up the words and seal the book. So Schwab was saying God intentionally hid these 166 years so people couldn't calculate the end times. Now, the time saver for us is that Schwab, 30 years later, in 1992, wrote a retraction to this view, saying, "But in the meantime, many great doubts have bothered my mind and have made it mandatory for me to share my pangs of conscience with my readers. History is either true or false. There is no middle ground. The events described in a history book have either happened or they haven't. A chronological timetable is the backbone of any book on history which expects to be accepted by intellectually honest students. The hidden years theory necessitates the assumption that the construction of the temple lasted for a century and a half. It is because of all these 9 doubts that I have decided to put a big question mark after the words Jewish chronology. This may be a disappointment to some, but on the other hand, I muster the courage to belong to those who'd rather wish to be honest with themselves than to be right. And while we may keep on searching for the answers, we pray that Hashem may enlighten our eyes." Schwab nails it by saying the mindset should be to be intellectually honest with oneself, even when it refutes your deeply held beliefs, because you will find people still using this theory so they can keep their rabbinic dates intact. Rabbi Skobac clearly said that the Second Temple stood for 420 years, yet says that 18 years after Cyrus's decree in 3390 is 3408, but tags that date, rabbinic date, with 444 BC for Nehemiah. So he has to be using the hidden years theory in some fashion, as this date alone is greater than 420. Why keeping the rabbinic dates intact is so important for rabbis is because Schwab brought up another rabbinic comparative that is if the missing years were and should be included in, is that the year 6000 from creation is now a lot closer at hand. So, the present day calculation of 5780, because Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, just occurred on September 19th, needs to be recalculated, making it 5946 according to the adjusted rabbinic dates. This is not me endorsing the number, it's just simply showing you the math. Why the year 6000 from creation is so important to them is that the end of days
is attached to it in rabbinic eschatology. Thus, the rabbis are working from a creation week model that we saw with many of the earlier Christian views in prior videos. Schwab points to this in the Talmud, with we even see here Avodah Zarah 9a, that laid out the Persian period through the Herodian years in the rabbinic system. It also stated, in relation to the discussion on the calculation of years, the Gemara states that one of the sages of the school of Eliyahu taught the world is destined to exist for 6,000 years. For 2,000 years, the world was waste, as the Torah had not yet been given. The next set of 2,000 years are the time period of the Torah. The last set of 2,000 years are the period designated for the days of the Messiah. That's right, people. There were rabbis teaching and trying to predict when the Messiah would come. In this creation week model, there's a 2,000 messianic year period. And in Sanhedrin 97a, this is described as well with a little more detail to the Torah and messianic periods from the same school of Eliyahu. With our modern rabbis is that you will see the messianic age included on Rabbi Singer's 70 weeks chart, because he says that at the end of them, that this age could begin based upon Daniel 9:24's 6 imperatives. That's right. Just because the rabbis don't believe the Mashiach references in verses 25 and 26 are about the King Messiah, doesn't mean that the rabbis don't view the 70 weeks messianically. Oh, your hearts have got to be pounding now. But due to our many sins, there are those that have taken from them, i.e., such and such years have already passed and have been taken from the 2,000 years that are designated for the Messiah, and the Messiah has not yet arrived. The key word here is arrived. The school of Eliyahu continued from 97a to 97b, saying that this is the course that history was to take. But due to our sins, that this time frame increased. The Messiah did not come after 4,000 years passed, and furthermore, the years that elapsed since then, which were to have been the Messianic era, have elapsed. So, this Pharisaic rabbinic school of thought believed that the King Messiah was supposed to come at the year 4000, but didn't, or has yet, during their so-called Messianic age. So, factoring in their 70 AD date is that 241 AD would be the rabbinic year 4000 for his expected arrival. 97b continues with Rabbi Yehuda saying, the world will exist no fewer than 85 Jubilee cycles, or 4,250 years. And during the final Jubilee, the Son of David will come. So he chimes in his own predicted date for the arrival of the Messiah using Jubilee cycles of 50 years each. Gee, I wonder where he got that whole Jubilee cycle idea from. Another rabbi mentioned that a found scroll said that the year 4291 will be when the wars of Gog and Magog will end, with the Messianic period continuing on. Why that number is not just some random Powerball guess is because the Seder Olam says that the Second Temple was destroyed at the end of a sabbatical year. Yes, I know there's a translation debate about this, but just roll with it for now. The point is that 4291 is exactly 66 sabbatical cycles, or you could say weeks of years, after the Second Temple's destruction. Pretty close to 70, isn't it? Kind of just hard to see all this as just coincidental. Rabbi Nathan rejected other rabbis who said that the Messiah would come based upon an interpretation of Daniel 7:25, multiplying the Egyptian period of exile by 3.5, the time times in half, and also rejected Rabbi Simuli using Psalm 80 to multiply the exile in Egypt by 3 to predict his coming,
and also rejected Rabbi Akiva that the messianic redemption would happen soon after the destruction of the temple based upon Haggai 2:6. So what's the point with all this? The point is that there were numerous rabbis during the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD trying to calculate the Messiah's arrival, and were also teaching a creation week model with the 7th millennium being the Sabbath millennium. And with all these end time predictions floating around, is that Rabbi Jonathan said, "May those who calculate the end of days be cursed," as they would say once the end of days that they calculated arrived and the Messiah did not come, that he will no longer come at all. Rather, the proper behavior is to continue to wait for his coming. This is where the so-called rabbinic curse for reading Daniel comes from. And FYI, if you've been taught this, is that whole notion is just utter garbage. The context here is one rabbi getting fed up with so many other rabbis attempting to predict the Messiah's coming and watching them fail over and over again, because it's just getting the people way too excited and then it's fail. It's just boom and bust over and over again. But what I'm sure you have been wondering is if the rabbis were using Daniel's 70 weeks to try and calculate the Messiah's arrival. And the answer is, they pretty much were. Before the School of Eliyahu in Sanhedrin 97a gave its view on the scope of history, is that at the very beginning of 97a, it says, "The sages taught in a Baraita with regard to the 7-year period, i.e. the sabbatical cycle, during which the Messiah, the son of David, comes." Right there, you have a week of years tagged with the Messiah's arrival. Daniel 9 is the only place that has both of these concepts together in the entire Old Testament. It continues on describing this 7-year period, year by year, with what events that will take place within all of them, with the 7th year saying, "During the sabbatical year, wars, like the war of Gog and Magog, will be waged involving the Jewish people. During the year after the conclusion of the sabbatical year, the Son of David will come." This you will see similarly discussed in Megillah 17b. Ultimately, this 7-year period described with eschatological wars taking place and the Messiah's arrival at the end of it can only be pulled from the 70th week in Daniel 9:27. There's simply no other place in the Bible where all these ideas could be singularly drawn from. And with all of this messianic expectation at the conclusion of Daniel's 70 weeks, is that a legend began to be spread that on the day that the temple was destroyed, that the King Messiah was born. And this carried on for centuries, as Rabbi Ibn Ezra said that the earlier sages taught this as well. And at the very end of Rabbi Skobac's lecture, you will see him bring this up as well, that the Messiah's arrival is tied with the 70 weeks. So, for these modern counter-missionary rabbis to deride Christians for interpreting the 70 weeks messianically is completely hypocritical, especially after seeing that the 2nd and 3rd century rabbis were repeatedly making attempts to calculate the Messiah's arrival using the 70 weeks or some variation thereof. And the final nail on the head against these modern rabbis is from Megillah 3a that says that the reason why Rabbi Jonathan ben Uzziel was denied permission to translate the books in the writing section of the Tanakh into Aramaic for his Targum is because it has in it a revelation of the end when the Messiah will arrive as foretold in a cryptic manner in the book of Daniel. Reminder, hit the subscribe button below, turn on the notification bell, hit the like button, leave a comment, and don't forget to visit us at justscripture.org. But in the meantime, stay salty.